Thank you for joining me to hear about the RAF 100 Bomber Support Group. I need to begin by saying that I'm not an historian and no expert on the RAF or this part of it. I've gathered information from a range of online and other sources, especially the book by Martin Bowman, 100 Group Bomber Support. I recommend this as a detailed account of the places, planes and people involved in the story, and I would also refer to a few websites where more information can be found. I'm aiming to give you an overview of the group and a few deeper dives into aspects which I think are especially interesting. So where to begin? Well, I think the group badge is a good place to start. The motto, as you can see, is Confound and Destroy, and a profile of the Gorgon Medusa is at the centre. As you may know, Medusa is from Greek mythology, and she could turn anyone looking at her to stone. She symbolises a number of ideas, including protection, power, a dangerous destructive force, sometimes seen as a symbol of overcoming trauma and reclaiming power. So what was the group about? Well, it was a special duties group within RAF Bomber Command, formed to consolidate the increasingly complex business of electronic warfare and countermeasures in one organisation. The group developed and tested electronic warfare and countermeasures equipment. This equipment was used to confuse enemy air defences and aircraft in support of Allied bombing raids, and was accompanied by fighters patrolling the skies and German airfields to destroy enemy planes. So you can see its motto and the Medusa head sum up its role in confounding and destroying the enemy. Why was the group needed? Well, in May 1940, RAF Bomber Command decided to begin strategic bombing of Germany by night, following heavy losses during daylight raids. At this point, there was little the Luftwaffe could do to counter these early attacks, but they began to develop a radar-controlled air defence system. Allied bombing crews had to come to terms with flying and bombing by night. Few had the experience of flying long distances by night, sometimes in appalling weather conditions, let alone against highly efficient enemy defences. To find their way, crews used dead reckoning navigation. That's calculating the position of something from the distance it's covered and the direction it's travelled. Or perhaps map reading, if they could see the ground, of course. Sophisticated navigational aids would come much later in the war. A 1940 military investigation undertaken by the British revealed that just 1 in 5 aircraft was succeeding in dropping its bombs within 5 miles of its target. Under such circumstances, the bombing offensive could only be effective if it was directed at targets as big as cities. Throughout the summer of 1940, attacks were made on targets in several German cities and the Ruhr Valley, but improved German defences resulted in mounting Allied losses. Pictured here is a Bristol Blenheim of No. 110 Squadron in June 1940. The Bristol Blenheim was the Bomber Command's principal light bomber in the early years of the war. Allied losses continued through to 1942. The RAF switched tactics to area bombing rather than precision targeting, so bombing civilian as well as military targets and industrial sites. This was almost entirely at night time. Here's a cartoon that rather sums up the Allied lack of bombing precision. Joking aside, what you might call a shift to a state of total war developed. Driven by the will to stay alive, people will do unimaginable things of one kind or another, and actions can spiral out of control very quickly. World War II developed into total war, and many millions of human beings were killed or forced into a state of shock, fear, or long-term injuries to their physical and mental health. Despite the move to area bombing, Allied losses continued to be high. A record 147 Bomber Command aircraft were destroyed in June 1942 alone, and further losses mounted up in the year that followed. At around this time, the Germans developed night fighter aircraft, and one factor in their success was an airborne radar system called Liechtenstein. This is a picture of a Junkers Ju-88 aircraft of the Luftwaffe fitted with this airborne radar. In response, Winston Churchill decided that the way forward lay in secret electronic warfare. This meant decoding enemy signals, identifying and jamming radar, intercepting communications, broadcasting rogue instructions, and generally using whatever methods they could to confuse the enemy, and whilst doing so, build as much knowledge as they could for planning future operations. How did the group operate? Well, towards the end of 1942, the RAF managed to monitor German radio traffic and sent up an aircraft as bait to detect the source of the German transmissions. As a result, countermeasures were put into effect. It started very simply. Strips of black paper with aluminium foil stuck to one side were dropped by aircraft in bundles of 1,000, released at 1-minute intervals. This window, as it was called, we now call it chaff, reflected the German radio waves and disrupted the information they received. Here's a photo of a Lancaster bomber dropping chaff. The period that followed became known as the Battle of the Beams, as other radio countermeasure devices were developed. Between 1944 and 45, RAF night bomber raids had support from 100 bomber support squadrons, using a range of electronic countermeasures. Some would drop window, others would gather electrical intelligence, some would jam German ground control, and others would jam anti-aircraft or flak guns. During 100 Group's existence, over 32 different devices were evaluated and used. Specially equipped aircraft would fly in the bomber stream with equipment which had a range of fascinating names, as you can see here. Jammers, called airborne cigar, jostle, mandrel, airborne grocer, pipe rack, carpet. Homers called Perfectos, Saratan, Lucero, and a spoofer called Corona. Here's one unnamed man's experience of electronic warfare. Quote, "Upon arrival, the first thing was a few days' introduction to the equipment we were to operate. It went under the code name ABC, which stood for Airborne Cigar. I have no idea why they named it that. It consisted of 3 enormous powerful transmitters covering the radio voice bands used by the Luftwaffe. To help identify the place to jam, there was a panoramic receiver covering the same bands. The receiver scanned up and down the bands at high speed, and the result of its travel was shown on a time base calibrated across a cathode ray tube in front of the operator. If there was any traffic on the band, it showed as a blip on the appropriate frequency along the line of light that was the time base. When a blip appeared, one could immediately spot tune the receiver to it and listen to the transmission. If the language was German, then it only took a minute to swing the first of the transmitters to the same frequency, press a switch, and leave a powerful jamming warble there to prevent the underlying voice being heard. The other 2 transmitters could then be brought in on other blips. If 24 aircraft were flying, spread through the bomber stream, then there were a potential 72 loud jamming transmissions blotting out the night fighters' directions. The Germans tried all manner of devices to overcome the jamming, including having their instructions sung by Wagnerian sopranos. This was to fool our operators into thinking it was just a civilian channel and not worth jamming. I think ABC probably did a useful job, but who can say what difference it made?" End quote. Well, a post-mortem on the use of these countermeasures demonstrated that they had been a great success. And of course we mustn't forget the aircraft the group used to carry this equipment and to shoot down enemy aircraft. Mosquito night fighters such as this would patrol the sides of the bomber stream, crisscrossing above the bombers. The size of the bomber stream varied as numbers varied according to weather conditions, skill of air crews, time of day, and so on. A 500 to 600 bomber force could be 70 miles wide. On one occasion in 1945, a force of 1,000 American bombers was 360 miles long, and when the first bombers arrived over Berlin, the last bombers were still over the Zuider Zee in Holland. The aircraft used by the 100 Group were varied, but I think the de Havilland Mosquito deserves special mention, otherwise known as the Wooden Wonder. Click on the link to see a short film from the time about its design and manufacture. The Mosquito had 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, like this one on show at the City of Norwich Aviation Museum. A thing of beauty, eh? When was the 100 Group operational? This timeline gives some key dates in the formation and development of the group. The group, originally named Special Duties, was formed in November 1943 at Radlett, Hertfordshire, so about a year after the beginnings of the development of countermeasures. Its first unit was 192 Squadron, whose aircraft had been used for monitoring German radio traffic. The squadron moved to RAF Falsham in December 1943. The group headquarters was initially at West Raynham. The first operation was not very encouraging. Only a handful of aircraft were available to support a bombing raid on Berlin on the night of the 16th and 17th of December 1943. This night became known as Black Thursday. 59 Allied bombers were lost due to enemy action, bad weather, crashes and fuel loss. The first group's success was a Junkers Ju-88 shot down a few days later. The group's headquarters moved to Byler Hall in January 1944. About 5 miles from East Dereham, it provided a more central location from which to administer the group's airfields across Norfolk. The squadrons involved at this stage had old aircraft in poor condition, and these problems persisted even when all 3 squadrons were operational in late January 1944. In May that year, the group was renamed Bomber Support, and as you can see, over the course of the next year it acquired several additional airfields and eventually had 8, with a total of 260 aircraft of various types. Following the end of the war in Europe in May 1945 and later against Japan, the group disbanded on the 17th of December 1945. So you can see that the group had a relatively short life, less than 2 years, but as we'll see, its impact was very significant. Where was the group based? Well, it had eventually 8 airfields plus its headquarters at Byler Hall. The 8 airfields can be seen on this map from the City of Norwich Aviation Museum. The aircraft used were varied and were changed around during the operations of the group. I'd like to focus in more detail on RAF Swannington as one example of a 100 group airfield, one which is especially important to Havringland as we sit right next to it. Havringland Hall and its surrounding parkland was taken over in 1942 by the Air Ministry to establish Swannington Airfield, known locally as Havringland Airfield, in which parish most of its lay. So what was the impact of this new airfield? John, or Jack Kett, former lay preacher at Havringland and head teacher of Corston Primary School, said in his book Havringlander from 1994, "Looking at the church today, sentinel-like in the bare landscape, it seems incredible that a few years ago it nestled in the shelter of a great forest of trees, oak, chestnut and beech, themselves the glory of a great park stretching through massive wrought iron gates. On past the lodge which housed the village post office, through a majestic avenue of horse chestnut trees, beautiful in spring with their pink candle-like blossoms. A wall some miles in length encompassed the whole. Further afield, deep hollows by the wayside concealed a wealth of primroses, while a group of pine and spreading woodland continued far outside the boundary walls. All of this was levelled to the ground as an aerodrome took shape. A gap of a mile was torn in the wall, lodge gates were removed and the lodge itself blown up without ceremony. As runways crossed and recrossed the greenwood, each primrose hollow was obliterated with rubble brought by countless lorries from local gravel pits. The trees were carried off in mournful procession. The hall survived for a time, useful for billeting the flying men. The contract to build the airfield was worth over £880,000. It brought with it new sounds and, as we've heard, completely changed the local landscape, removing or realigning roads and creating new structures. There were 2 main squadrons of 100 group based here, numbers 157 and 85, flying Mosquitoes on night fighter and intruder missions, including the early use of electronic countermeasures. During their operations, the 2 squadrons lost a total of 19 aircraft. You can see the mottos: 157, our cannons speak our thoughts, and of 85, translated into we hunt by day or night. Here's a well-known photo of a Mosquito parked up in what is now the car park for the church. You can see on the church tower the camouflage netting that once hung there, and if you look on the tower today, you can still see the metal fixings. And here's a diorama created to give a 3D effect to what the scene might have looked like, with some artistic license, I think. By early 1944 there was accommodation for 1,956 airmen and 450 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAFs. Here's an image of the northern part of the airfield showing Havringland Hall from the air as a group of, I think, Liberator bombers flew over. And here's an outline plan of the airfield to give you an idea of the layout. Here's Havringland Church. You can view this diagram in more detail on the heritage board near the car park to the church. Towards the end of 1944 and early 1945, 3 squadrons of Spitfires were detached to Swanington from their home bases for training and special strikes, including the attacking of launch sites of V-2 missiles in Holland. The hall shown here was used as officers' quarters, and other buildings and structures were erected. In 1945 the estate reverted to private use, and for a time the Duncan Healey Motor Company used some of the buildings to assemble motor cars, as you can see here, bussing in hundreds of people every day. The hall was demolished, and in 1953 much of it began its current use as a lodge park. Portions of runway and peripheral roads are still around, like those just outside the church. Today much of the aerodrome has been reclaimed for agriculture, poultry rearing or grazing for rescued horses and ponies by Hillside Animal Sanctuary. Here's one of our neighbours. I've talked about why the 100 Bomber Support Group was formed, what it did, its development, and how and where it operated from. It remains for me to cover probably the most important aspect of the group, the people involved. As you will have already gathered, there were thousands of RAF and other personnel involved across the airfields and group headquarters. So, who to feature? Let's start with the boss, Air Vice Marshal Edward Barker Addison. He served as Air Officer commanding No. 100 Group from 1943 to 1945, and so was his only commander. He previously served with the Royal Flying Corps and the RAF during the First World War. After that war he studied at university and then re-entered the RAF in 1921. After further engineering studies and various RAF postings, Addison retired from the RAF in 1955 to a civilian career, maintaining a close involvement with the electronics field until his retirement in 1975. And of course we must mention the thousands of servicemen and women who formed the 100 Bomber Support Group. Here's a couple of more formal group shots, first of 85 Squadron in front of a thimble-nosed mosquito. And the second is of 157 Squadron outside Havringland Hall. And of course it's even better when you can catch them off guard. Here's a group of off-duty airmen relaxing inside Havringland Hall. I'd like to turn for a moment to a couple of famous airmen from the group who also served at RAF Swanington, the Night Hawk partners, Wing Commander Brands Burbridge and Flight Lieutenant Bill Skelton. Burbridge and Skelton were the top Mosquito crew in 100 Group, with 21 nighttime enemy aircraft shot down between 1944 to 45. Burbridge was born in February 1921 into a family with strong Christian and pacifist beliefs. Upon the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939, he registered himself as a conscientious objector, but in 1940 he changed his mind and enlisted in the RAF. Burbridge completed his training within a year, was posted to No. 85 Squadron, and by the end of 1942 had claimed one probable enemy plane shot down and another damaged. After a period as an instructor and staff officer, he returned to operations in late 1943 with radar operator Bill Skelton, achieving much success in a relatively short time. The Hun board for RAF Swanington on the right, which you can see for real at the City of Norwich Aviation Museum, shows the pair with 5 German aircraft shot down during 1944. On one occasion in late 1944, Skelton manoeuvred Burbridge so skillfully onto his German targets that the pair shot down 2 German night fighters. They then craftily joined enemy aircraft circling a German airfield and claimed 2 further enemy aircraft. Despite heavy damage, they coaxed their Mosquito back to their base. Burbridge said, quotes, "I always tried to aim for the wings of enemy aircraft and not the cockpit. I never wanted to kill anyone." After the end of the war in May 1945, Burbridge stayed in the RAF for a further 7 months before resigning his commission. He studied at Oxford and Cambridge universities before entering the Christian ministry. In February 2013, Burbridge's family reported that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and they were considering selling his medals and wartime memorabilia to fund his private care home. Perhaps not surprisingly, Burbridge's medals fetched £155,000 at auction. Skelton's brilliance with airborne radar over Britain and Germany was recognised with the awards of a DFC and bar and a DSO and bar. The citations of both Skelton and Burbridge referred to them setting, open quotes, an unsurpassed example of outstanding keenness and devotion to duty. What about the unsung or less mentioned heroes and heroines of the group? Here's a photo of a group responsible for parachute and dinghy packing at RAF Swannington. And what was daily life like at one of the group's airfields? This is what one member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force reported on her experiences at RAF Falsham. Quote, "The tannoy blared." This was the loudspeaker system throughout the entire training camp. "It was 5 a.m, time to get up. This was the life I was going to have with 462 Squadron 100 Group Bomber Command at the Falsham Airdrome in East Anglia. Cold? I don't think I was ever so cold. We rushed to the ablutions, the toilets, washrooms, call them what you like. The room consisted of a long row of wash basins against one wall, toilets along the other. Thank goodness there was hot water. We hurriedly wash and clean our teeth, with 45 minutes to do everything. Get dressed in full uniform, make beds according to regulations, be ready for inspection and drill square." The beds, metal cots, had 3 pads used for the mattress called biscuits, 2 sheets, a pillow and 4 dark grey blankets which were wool, thick, heavy and not that warm. The bed had to be stripped every morning and made up perfectly, but not the way one ordinarily makes a bed, oh no. First, blanket had to be folded exactly in 4 lengthwise and laid across the bottom of the bed. Then the 3 biscuits were stacked on top of this blanket. The corners of the biscuits had to match perfectly before the 3 blankets were folded in 4 perfectly, then folded in 3s and laid on top of the biscuits. Then the sheets folded the same way, then the pillow. The first blanket needed to be brought up and around all this pile and overlapped on the top perfectly. Oh my, what a to-do! We had to stand by the side of our bed and hope all met with approval. Woe betide you if you got a demerit, which of course at the beginning happened to many of us. It was a mark against the whole hut. There would be a lot of competition between the huts. Ours was C Hut. The first day we were issued with our uniforms. The underwear, oh my! I wonder how the modern generation would feel about our Air Force issue. It really was terrible, but of course we wore it because we had to. We got very few clothing coupons while in the service to buy anything else. It was considered unnecessary. We had shirts with detachable collars and black ties, blue cotton stockings, and our shoes. Whew. So says Joy Hall, nay Hallgood. What was the outcome of 100 Bomber Support Group's operations? Well, perhaps the best compliment can come from your enemy. Here's what Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland said. Quote, "The combination of the Pathfinder's operations, the activities of No. 100 Group, the British advantage in radar, jamming and window techniques, combined with intelligent attacking tactics, as well as the discipline and bravery of RAF crews, have been remarkable. We had severe problems in trying to defend Germany in the air." And finally, let us remember the sacrifices made by so many men and women in the RAF 100 Bomber Support Group and beyond. We have 2 Commonwealth war graves in Aberdeen Churchyard, which mark the graves of 2 former 100 Group servicemen. They remind us that many lost their lives, not in battle, but through mechanical failures, weather or other technical faults, and others died of illnesses. First, Flying Officer Geoffrey Neil Edwards. On the return journey after an enemy raid in his Mosquito aircraft on the night of the 22nd December 1944, Geoffrey reported aileron problems to flying control. The aircraft crashed near the airfield. Both Geoffrey and his pilot, Flight Lieutenant William Taylor, died in the crash. Geoffrey was aged 22 and William was aged 23. Geoffrey was named in dispatches on the 5th of February 1944 for his bravery. Second, Corporal Cecil Albert Mace. Cecil enlisted with the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve and was posted to RAF Swannington. Leading aircraftman Mace was a driver with 274 Maintenance Unit. He died of an illness in the Norfolk Norwich Hospital on the 23rd of August 1947 at the age of 40, so some time after the war had ended and as RAF Swannington was being decommissioned. To conclude, we have this wonderful painting by Rory Kent called Havering Homecoming, showing a mosquito returning over the tower of the church. Thanks to the many sites and places that have provided information or images, especially our own local historian Lorna Wilson and the work she's put into the Havering Chronicles website and our Heritage Hub, both places where you can find out more about the RAF 100 Bomber Support Group, RAF Swannington, and so much more about local history. Thanks also to lottery players and the National Lottery Heritage Fund for their financial support for our project. And thank you for joining me today. You can find other narrated presentations on Haveringland's heritage on our YouTube channel. Just look for Haveringland Church and Community Hub.